Yolanda woke before dawn, as she always did, to the sounds of Soweto stirring outside her shack. The early morning air was crisp, a brief reprieve before the heat of the day settled in. Her children still slept soundly in the cramped one-room space they called home. It was a far cry from comfort with its corrugated iron roof and makeshift walls, but it was all she could afford. She gazed at their small faces, momentarily letting the weight of her life sink in. 4 children, and she was doing it all alone. She moved quietly, getting ready for the day, her mind already on her new job. Today would be the first Saturday cleaning a house in the nearby suburb of Crestview. It wasn't the first time she'd taken on extra work. Her weekday shifts at the casino barely paid enough to keep her and the children fed. This new job, however, promised better pay, and though it would mean one less day to rest, she couldn't afford to turn it down. By the time she stepped out into the morning light, the streets of Soweto were fully alive. Taxis hooted impatiently, children played in the dusty streets, and the smell of early cooking wafted through the air. She walked quickly to the main road, catching a minibus taxi to Crestview. As the taxi weaved through the streets, she stared out of the window, watching the landscape shift from the noisy, crowded township to the quiet, tree-lined avenues of the suburb. Crestview was a world apart. The lawns were green, the houses large and elegant, each with high walls and security gates. As the taxi dropped her off at the end of a quiet street, she felt a mixture of nerves and excitement. She took a deep breath and began walking toward the house she'd be cleaning. The street was beautiful, almost dreamlike. Birds chirped in the trees that lined the sidewalks, and the air smelled clean and fresh, unlike the dust and smoke of her own neighborhood. Yolanda couldn't help but admire it all, wondering what it would be like to live in a place like this. The peace, the silence, how she wished her children could grow up in a place like this. But as she neared the house she was headed to, a strange feeling crept over her. The house stood at the very end of the street, surrounded by thick trees that cast dark shadows over the lawn. The house itself looked much older than the others, its paint faded, windows dirty. The trees around it were so overgrown that they seemed to close in on the building, giving it a gloomy, almost suffocating presence. She stopped at the gate, hesitating. Something about the house felt wrong, but she reminded herself of the good pay. She couldn't afford to be picky. As she pushed the gate open and approached the front door, she was met by the sight of a tall, thin white man standing in the doorway. His clothes were wrinkled, and his glasses sat crooked on his nose. His hair, disheveled and graying, added to his unkempt appearance. He gave her a faint smile, though it seemed more out of obligation than warmth. "You must be Yolanda," he said, his voice thin and slightly raspy. "Welcome. I'm Mr. Byers." She nodded politely, though her unease deepened. The house loomed behind him, its windows like dark eyes staring at her. Inside, the air smelled stale, and a strange odor, something she couldn't quite place, lingered. But she pushed her discomfort aside. Good pay, she reminded herself again. Good pay. Mr. Byers was brief. He explained the tasks for the day and told her he'd be out for a few hours to visit the pharmacy. He chuckled awkwardly, mentioning how early they closed on Saturdays, and with that he rushed out, slamming the door behind him. Yolanda stood alone in the house, staring at the mess. The place was untidy papers strewn across the floor, dust coating nearly every surface. She cringed inwardly but got to work, trying to focus on the job at hand. As she cleaned, she noticed odd things. There were photos on the walls, family portraits. But in each one, the faces of the woman and children had been scratched out. A chill ran down her spine. She tried not to think too much of it, moving from room to room, cleaning as quickly and efficiently as possible. But the longer she stayed in the house, the more unsettled she became. Then it started. At first it was subtle a sound, like a door sliding open in one of the rooms upstairs. She paused, her hand stilling over the surface she was wiping. Listening, she convinced herself it was nothing, perhaps a draft or the house settling. But moments later she heard the distinct sound of 2 doors slamming shut. Her heart quickened. She set down the rag she'd been using and slowly made her way through the house, checking every room. Nothing was out of place, no sign of Mr. Bayers, no sign of anyone. Yet the sound had been so clear. She returned to cleaning, trying to shake off the sense of dread creeping up her spine. But then, as she dusted a shelf in the living room, she heard it, a faint giggle, the unmistakable sound of a child's laughter. She froze. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. There were no children in the house. She was sure of that. Yolanda forced herself to move, to check again, though her legs felt heavy with fear. She searched the house once more, but again there was nothing. Everything was still quiet. Too quiet. She tried to push the fear aside, telling herself it was her imagination playing tricks on her. But deep down, she knew something was wrong with this house. She could feel it in the air, in the walls. When she stepped outside to hang the laundry, she was relieved to be in the open air again, away from the oppressive atmosphere of the house. But even outside, something felt off. The backyard was vast, far larger than she'd expected, and the clothesline was far from the house, almost at the edge of the property, hidden by thick bushes and tall trees. She hung the clothes quickly, eager to get back inside and finish up so she could leave. But when she returned to the house, things took a darker turn. She heard another noise this time, from the main bedroom. Something had fallen, and she distinctly heard someone shushing the sound. Her body went cold. She stood there, frozen in fear, her mind racing. There was someone in the house, someone she hadn't seen. She could feel their presence now, watching her, waiting. She bolted for the door, her heart pounding in her chest. But as she reached for the handle, Mr. Bayer's car pulled up in the driveway. She stopped panicking. She couldn't leave without finishing. She needed the money. She had to calm down. She took a deep breath and tried to compose herself. She would finish quickly and leave. She wouldn't come back. She would find another job. But as she walked back to the laundry line to collect the clothes, she stopped in her tracks. The back door was open. She was sure she had closed it. Slowly she stepped toward the door, her heart racing again. When she looked out into the yard, her blood ran cold. The clothes were gone. She stared, wide-eyed, at the empty line. Her mind reeled. Had someone taken them? She hadn't been gone that long. Her heart pounded louder now, her thoughts frantic. She turned, ready to leave, but as she stepped back into the house, something even stranger awaited her. There on the sofas in the living room were the clothes neatly folded. Someone had folded them. Yolanda's breath caught in her throat. Her legs felt weak beneath her as she stared at the clothes, her mind struggling to make sense of what was happening. Then, from the corner of her eye, she saw movement in the mirror on the wall. Slowly she turned to face it, her skin prickling with terror. In the reflection she saw the small square door in the ceiling of the hallway sliding open. And then a thin, pale leg began to emerge from the attic. She screamed a long, guttural scream of pure terror and ran for the door. She could hear footsteps behind her, the sound of someone or something chasing her. But she didn't stop. She burst out of the house, tears streaming down her face, her body shaking uncontrollably. Mr. Bayers was standing in the driveway, startled by her screams. He rushed toward her, trying to calm her down, but she was hysterical. She tried to explain, her words tumbling over each other, but he kept telling her to be quiet, to hush. His voice grew more frantic, more desperate, until finally he yelled at her to shut up. The commotion had drawn the attention of the neighbors. They began to gather outside, their eyes narrowing at Mr. Bayers. They had never liked him. He was strange, reclusive, and ever since his wife and children had mysteriously disappeared months ago, they had become suspicious. One of the neighbors, a burly man with a stern expression, stepped forward and pushed Mr. Bayers away from Yolanda. "What's going on here?" he demanded. "What did you do to her?" Yolanda, still shaking, managed to gasp out the words. I saw a ghost. In his house. There are voices. Voices in the walls." The neighbors exchanged shocked glances. Some of them began murmuring, others moved toward the house. The burly man shot Mr. Bayers a dark look. "You've got some explaining to do." As the neighbors stormed into the house, Yolanda stood in the street, trembling. It wasn't until she saw the police arrive and the flurry of activity that followed that she realized what had happened. She had solved the mystery of Mr. Bayers' missing family. Yolanda never returned to that house. As she rode the taxi back to Soweto, she stared out of the window, her mind still reeling from the day's events. The streets of Soweto were noisy and chaotic. Usually this would drive her crazy, but today the sound of her busy township gave her a strange sense of comfort. She was home, and for now that's all that mattered. "15 years had passed since that day, the day Yolanda stood trembling in the street, surrounded by concerned neighbors, and watched as the police carted off Mr. Bayers, the tall man with the disheveled appearance and eerie calm, to prison. The truth of what had happened in that house on Hazy Street, with its thick, twisted trees and dark windows, had taken weeks to fully come out. Mr. Bayers hadn't just been the strange man with a missing family. He had been a monster, keeping his wife and children trapped in the attic for months after they had attempted to leave him. The police had found them emaciated, terrified, but alive, thanks to Yolanda's instincts. But now Mr. Bayers was free. The news had spread like wildfire across the city of Johannesburg. The attic man, as the press had called him, was out of prison after serving 15 years of his sentence. They had said he was rehabilitated, that he had shown signs of improvement. But some people, especially those who lived near Hazy Street, didn't buy it. People didn't change that drastically, they said, not someone like Mr. Bayers. A man who had once kept his own family hidden away like possessions wasn't likely to emerge from prison as a changed man. And they were right. Mr. Bayers had returned to his old house. The house, with its suffocating atmosphere and strange silence, had been left untouched for all those years. No one had wanted to buy it, no one dared go near it. The rumors about the house being cursed lingered in the air, adding to the local folklore. Children dared each other to walk past it at night, but no one lingered long. It sat like a rotting tooth in an otherwise pristine suburb, a reminder of the horrors that had unfolded there. But for Mr. Bayers, the house was home. He had returned to it as if stepping into an old, comfortable coat. The neighborhood had changed, but his obsession had not. And that obsession, for all those long years in prison, had shifted focus. It was no longer about his family. They had moved on, had left the country, as far away from him as they could get. No, his thoughts during those lonely nights in his cell had turned toward someone else. Yolanda. The woman who had uncovered the truth. The woman who had seen what no one else had. The woman who had ruined his life. At first, the memories of her had been mingled with rage-burning resentment that she had taken away his family, had destroyed his carefully constructed world. But over time, something darker had twisted within him. That anger had slowly turned into obsession. She had been strong, resilient, clever. And now, with his family gone, he had only one thought left. He had to find her. Yolanda had moved on with her life. In the years following the incident, she had left the cleaning job at the casino and eventually started her own small cleaning business. It was nothing big, just her and a few women she had trained. But it was enough to keep her going, enough to support her children as they grew older. Her eldest son, Lucky, was a success. He had gotten a good job working for the city, and now at 22, he had taken on the role of the family's primary provider. Yolanda's other children were still studying or working, but Lucky had always felt a special responsibility to his mother. He knew the sacrifices she had made, how hard she had worked to give them all a chance at a better life. And now, with his steady job and a small house of his own, Lucky had made a decision one he planned to surprise his mother with on her 40th birthday. He had secretly built her a house. It wasn't extravagant, but it was beautiful. Nestled in a peaceful suburb far from the noisy streets of Soweto, it was a dream come true. Lucky had taken care of every detail. He'd even managed to buy her favorite flowers, lilies, for the garden, planning to surprise her when the time was right. The house was waiting, just like the big announcement. Yolanda would finally get to rest, to enjoy her life, without having to clean for anyone else ever again. But she never saw that house. Mr. Bears had been careful. It had taken him months to find her. He had spent countless hours on the phone, calling different cleaning agencies, using different names and voices, trying to find the woman who had haunted his thoughts for 15 years. But one day, finally, he heard it. Yolanda? Yes, she still works here. She mostly takes private jobs now, but I'm sure we can arrange something. Shall I have her call you? He could barely contain the excitement in his voice as he made the arrangements. He hadn't known what she would look like after all these years, but it didn't matter. She would be his, just like his family had been. His property to control and contain. Yolanda had been wary when she got the call. The new client had requested her by name, saying he had heard great things about her from a mutual friend. She had stopped taking on many new clients, especially with her son planning her retirement soon, but the offer had been too tempting. The money was good, and she had thought it would be just another job to see her through the last few months. But the moment she arrived at the house, she felt it. The sense of dread, of something horribly familiar, washed over her the moment she saw it, the house on Hazy Street. The thick trees, the dark windows, the same suffocating silence. She hadn't recognized the address when the agency had given it to her, but now that she stood at the gate, memories from 15 years ago rushed back in a wave that nearly knocked her off her feet. For a moment she considered turning back, running, and never looking back, but she was older now, wiser. And though the fear gnawed at her, the sense of duty and professionalism that had carried her through years of hard work kicked in. It was just a house. Mr. Bears was gone. She had no idea. Mr. Bears greeted her at the door, just as he had all those years ago, but he looked different now. The prison years had not been kind to him. His once tall frame was hunched, his face gaunt, and his eyes. They were darker, filled with something she couldn't quite place. When their eyes met, a cold shiver ran down her spine. "You've done well for yourself," he said, his voice scratchy, like it hadn't been used in years. "It's good to see you again, Yolanda," she froze. He remembered her. And that's when she knew she had made a terrible mistake. The job should have been simple: clean the house, get paid, and leave. But from the moment she stepped inside, Yolanda realized nothing about this would be simple. The house felt different, darker, colder. It was as if the very walls had soaked up all the evil that had once taken place there and were waiting for more. The air was thick with a tension that made it hard to breathe. And then there was Mr. Byers watching her, always watching. At first he tried to act normal, tried to be polite. He asked her how her life had been, how her children were doing. But the questions felt invasive, too personal. Every time he spoke, it was as if he was peeling away layers of her life, trying to get to the core of who she was. By the time she reached the upstairs rooms, she knew she couldn't stay. But it was already too late. When Yolanda went missing, no one knew where to start looking. Lucky had been planning to surprise her with the house in just 2 months, but now he was organizing search parties instead. The police said they were doing everything they could, but the truth was they had very few leads. No one had seen her after she left for work that day, and none of her friends or family knew anything about her new client. It wasn't until Lucky began retracing her steps that he found out she had been working for Mr. Byers. His blood ran cold. The man who had almost ruined his mother's life is back, and now, 15 years later, he had taken her. The new cleaning lady, her name was Lindy, had heard the stories. Every woman in Johannesburg who worked in cleaning had heard about the man on Hazy Street. But when the agency had offered her the job, the money had been too good to pass up. She didn't believe in ghosts, and even though she had heard about Yolanda's disappearance, she assumed it had nothing to do with the house. Until she started working there. The first day was uneventful. Lindy cleaned quietly, keeping her head down, doing her best to avoid the strange old man who kept to himself in his study. But as the hours passed, she began to feel the weight of the house pressing down on her. It was an odd sensation, like being watched from all directions, even when she was alone in the room. She tried to ignore it, but as she moved through the house, strange things began happening. She would hear footsteps above her head, even though she knew Mr. Byers was downstairs. Doors creaked open when she was sure she had closed them, and every so often she would catch a faint whisper, as if someone was speaking just out of earshot. It was on her second visit that things took a darker turn. As she was cleaning the upstairs hallway, she noticed a door she hadn't seen before. It was small, almost hidden, tucked into the corner of the ceiling. For a moment she thought it might just be an attic door, but something about it felt wrong. And then she heard it, a faint noise, like shuffling footsteps, followed by a soft whisper. A woman's voice. Her heart raced as she stood frozen in place, her mind racing through all the horror stories she had heard about the house. And then, as if pulled by some unseen force, she reached for the door. What she found inside was worse than any ghost story she had ever heard. Yolanda was alive, barely, hidden away in a small, suffocating room in the attic. Just like Mr. Byers' family had been all those years ago. He had kept her there, feeding her scraps, watching her with that same twisted obsession he had once reserved for his wife and children. Lindy's scream echoed through the house as she realized what had happened. But this time, Mr. Byers wouldn't get away with it. The police arrived minutes later, and Mr. Byers was arrested again. This time for good. He had tried to recreate the nightmare of his past, but this time he had been stopped. Yolanda, though weak and traumatized, survived, thanks to Lindy's bravery. And as for Yolanda, she finally got her happy ending. Her family, with Lucky at the helm, took her home to the new house he had built for her. It wasn't just a house, it was a new beginning, far away from the darkness of Hazy Street. And this time she wouldn't be cleaning it. She would be resting, safe and surrounded by love. And Mr. Byers? He would rot in prison, forever haunted by the woman who had escaped his grasp twice. The end.